There truly are no words to adequately express our profound outrage, our grief, and the tremendous pain in the past 48 hours. We spent the last days following news updates, checking on our loved ones, and falling into tears. Every Israeli knows someone who has been killed, injured, or taken hostage by Hamas terrorists. And I know so many of us joining this webinar have close family, friends, and colleagues whose lives have been lost or upended by these truly horrific events. Our hearts, our prayers, our thoughts, and our solidarity is with all of you and all of Israel in these tremendously dark days. There is no justification whatsoever for the horrific, brutal massacre the world witnessed. And I know so many of us are utterly dismayed by those that have been unable to unequivocally condemn the slaughter conducted by Hamas, or even to call it terrorism. But I also know that Israelis and communities across the United States have immediately sprung into action to offer support, to rally, to volunteer. Our hearts are truly broken for the people of Israel, and our thoughts are also with Palestinian civilians in Gaza who are suffering amidst this war that Hamas chose to launch. Israel Policy Forum is firmly committed to realizing a future in which Israel's security is not threatened and never again violated as it has been in the past 48 hours, and to ultimately finding a path to a more peaceful future between Israelis and Palestinians. But I want to acknowledge that this current situation is far from over. There are countless questions we all have and very few answers. Our conversation today will begin to analyze how could this have happened, but let us be clear that there is so much that we simply cannot know at this early stage. Nevertheless, to begin to grapple with all that has taken place, I'm so very grateful to be joined by my colleagues in Israel, in particular, who joined us here today for our conversation. I am going to begin by asking questions, but we do welcome your questions throughout today's conversation by please typing your question in the Q&A chat. Joining us today are my colleagues, first and foremost, Neri Zilber, Israel Policy Forum's policy advisor and host of our podcast, Israel Policy Pod. Neri has spent the last 48 hours furiously reporting, including publishing reports for Foreign Policy Magazine and the Financial Times. Shira Efron is our Diane and Guilford Glazer Senior Director for Policy Research, a longtime researcher on a variety of regional dynamics, diplomatic dynamics, and security dynamics inside Israel, impacting Israelis and Palestinians and the broader region. And we are also joined by our Israel fellow, Nimrod Novik, a longtime advisor to the late President Shimon Peres, and a longtime regional expert who's been involved in regional dialogues for decades. And lastly, I asked our Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow, to join us as well. So what we have today is really our team coming together after 2 days of this horrific tragedy. And I'm so grateful to have the expertise in this session. And I'm frankly grateful that you all are doing okay and hoping that your loved ones are all safe. Neri, I want to start with you, the reporter, to give us a bit of a lens on where we are now, 48 hours after this incident was first launched.
Sure. Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining us for this event. I'll just caveat what I'm going to say. Netanyahu is about to give an address to the nation, his second since this attack and this war really started. So I fully expect Hamas to be launching rockets in about 25 minutes. So I'm coming to you from Tel Aviv. So excuse me if I have to step away for a few minutes during a red alert siren. And with that said, look, I'm not going to rehash what happened. We can get into why it happened. But the state of play as it stands now is that the IDF has secured all of the communities in southern Israel. And yet, there still remain perhaps some Hamas cells operating in the area. And due to the many breaches in what was a previously heavily fortified border, barrier, fence, wall, whatever you want to call it, there are still some infiltrations by Hamas cells in and out of Gaza. So it's an ongoing concern, although the situation tonight is much better, say, than it was last night and even this morning, when there was still really active fighting ongoing in about 7 or 8 different locations. And obviously as well, the Israeli Air Force is striking Gaza very, very hard. We can talk about the number of rockets Hamas has fired. I think now it's probably over 4,000, maybe even close to 5,000, which, just to put it in comparison, throughout the entire May 2021 war, Hamas fired about 4,000 rockets total in about 11 days. And they've far surpassed that in less than 3 days. So just to keep that in mind, in terms of the firepower going back and forth, and the Israeli Air Force is striking Gaza quite hard. And that's in the southern front. And the real concern moving forward, and we can get into more detail later on, is the northern front, which did escalate somewhat throughout the course of today. We saw several mortars and rockets being fired onto Israel, and there were 2 infiltration attempts, at least one successful, from Lebanon into Israel, with some injured and perhaps a fatality on the Israeli side, although the Islamic Jihad cell, that they took credit for it from Lebanon, that infiltrated, I think most of those terrorists were killed. So it is a concern in terms of the northern front joining now the southern front and having this turn into a multi-front war. And finally, I'll just say 2 quick things in terms of the casualty numbers right now. Officially, there are 900 Israelis killed, 2,000 injured, and over 100 likely captured in captivity in Gaza. I expect all those numbers to rise, unfortunately. So I don't think we're at the end of it just yet, both in terms of Israeli fatalities and those being held by Hamas. And then the second point I'll say is that the fact that the Biden administration has come out so strongly in support of Israel during this very difficult time, especially moving that U.S. aircraft carrier strike group into the Eastern Mediterranean, should Israeli officials and the public, frankly, hope, deter Hezbollah and Iran and anyone else from getting involved in what's going to be an ongoing and, I believe, very long campaign by Israel in Gaza and against Hamas. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Neri. And, I think the point has been made that this is the greatest, death toll of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, but it's also, of course, when we think about the impact of the Second Intifada on relations between Israelis and Palestinians, on Israeli psyche, impacting a generation, we had just over 1,000 Israelis killed in the 4.5 years of the Second Intifada. And here we have it in a single day. It's just, it's simply astonishing. Shira, how could this have happened? First of all, I'm sorry, Shira, but I hope you're okay and you and your loved ones are okay. But please help us unpack your thoughts on how this could have happened.
So I can share how it's affecting me personally and my community or different circles, but yeah, thankfully I live in what you would call the Bethesda of Israel, and we are safe here, and fortunately we have shelters and safe rooms, and we are fine. How could it happened? I mean, the scale of what we're seeing now is the result of, and to sum it up, because we can go technically into every detail, and I don't think this is the place for it. There are going to be so many investigation committees and inquiry committees after this is over, when this is over. But there was clearly the intelligence failure all around. Intelligence failure at a scale that is bigger than what we had in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, because then you had countries, you had militaries. We have a terrorist organization here controlling a territory It is 141 square miles, right? This is the Gaza Strip. It's the area of Washington, D.C. There is not a single point of this territory that is not observed or listened to. It's really happened under Israel's nose and eyes. And there's this hubris of, oh, yeah, Hamas, they don't have these capabilities. They don't have what clearly this. So there's this intelligence failure. And if the reports that we heard today, that Netanyahu himself, the prime minister, received direct warning from the head of intelligence, the head of the Egyptian intelligence, and dismissed them, that would add to this failure. And, there are many reasons to explain why, because Israel does have great intelligence, how they missed that. And we can look at, sort of the concept with Hamas. We can see those disturbances on the barrier that we saw in the last few weeks that seem just like the normal, sort of like, oh, are these protests just trying to annoy us, disturb us? No, these were actually actions to detonate the fence in 80 places. But no one had thought about this because we're so assumed to be thinking that Hamas does those things only to extract more funding, more money, more support, right? And so, in a sense, you get used to something in your mind, and the way they did it, and during a holiday, and the time where so many forces, in fact, also the Gaza forces, were in the West Bank, not just because of this government's policies, which we can get into, but also because we here also said that the West Bank could be on fire any moment now. So there's the intelligence failure. But to add to this, there's this operational failure. It took so many hours. It is still taking hours to mobilize. This is a small country. We hear of these heroic actions by people that we know, Yair Golan, who spoke at IPF events. Noam Tibon, the father of Amir Tibon, Haaretz correspondent, friends of many people here on the podcast. I mean, but if you didn't know a two-star general to come and save you, people were just locked up. You hear the stories of really heroism. People were locked up in fridges, refrigerators, hiding babies. And it took a long time for the security forces to come together and act. There was a shell shock. It was initially described as an emergency, and then you think like, oh, who are we bringing? The police forces? Is it military? Who are we bringing? And added is the holiday and Shabbat and all these other reasons. So there's the intelligence failure, and on top of this, the scale is largely as a result also of the operational failure, that it took so long to respond, and definitely the fact that so many people were able to be abducted into Gaza, taken hostage into Gaza. And then on top of this, we're seeing a deep political failure, which I'm sure we can get into. That's really a lack of leadership. We can speak about how we even ended up in a situation, and IPF warned about it, that Israel's adversaries are watching and are emboldened and see the vulnerabilities. But the fact that it took, I don't know how many hours for the political leaderships to even come out. You saw former Prime Minister Bennett wearing uniforms and others, and the government with makeup on, giving a statement. I don't know how many hours later. Neri just warned us of the missiles where the rockets were going to be under probably in a few minutes, but this is statement number 2 of the Prime Minister. Yeah, how many hours are we after? The fact that there's no one to listen to, and there's no unity government, which the opposition leaders offered. And in every crisis in Israel history, the fact, the two sides came together, and this is by no means the gravest crisis Israel has ever faced, and it hasn't yet. So I think you take all these 3 crises together, and this is what we get.
Nimrod, I want to know your reaction to this question of how, but also what are the options now faced with this colossal crisis?
Yeah, thanks. The moment it started, my brain split between the sentimental that you, David, described at the outset about the horrific situation. And yes, as Shira said, we all know people who perished in this vicious assault. But the other part of the brain, it's probably a genetic deformation, was immediately analytical And I was asking myself, how did we get here? And I came up exactly with the same three layers of failure that Shira just mentioned. And I'd like to a little bit expand on each. The intelligence failure, I mean, the resemblance to 1973 and maybe other surprise situations in other countries is so striking that it is incredible. 50 years later, and the same three problems. One was our intelligence had all the information, everything. You know, Shira mentioned there's a big story in Israel evolving of Netanyahu having or having not, he denies it, spoken with the Egyptian chief of intelligence, who alerted him weeks earlier that this is coming. I tend to take at face value on this rare occasion a Netanyahu denial, but I was privy to a conversation with a senior Egyptian intelligence officer weeks before, who told me that they have conveyed that alert to his various Israeli counterparts. But I think we're making a big story of a story that does not exist, because there was nothing in the Egyptian warning that Israeli intelligence was not aware of. And the problem was interpretation. It was a belief, and Shira touched on it, that what Hamas was doing was either sort of showing its muscle for domestic needs, or trying to press Israel to make more concessions in terms of easing the siege on Gaza. And there was no willingness to consider that what they were doing was indeed practicing for an operation. So that's on the intelligence, same as 73. On the operational, also same as 73. We have discussed it here on IPF webinars and elsewhere, the security consequences of the government of insanity that we now have in Israel. And many people took it as theoretical. But in practice, when you look at what was the deployment of the IDF on the Gaza border at the moment of the assault, 80% of the Israeli standing army was deployed in the West Bank because Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the other lunatics have ignited the territories, and the IDF was busy with policing the territories rather than taking care of other fronts and preparing for such eventualities. So yes, as also Shira mentioned, operationally, there was an empty space. Interrogated Hamas captives have already confessed that they were shocked that the IDF did not expect them and waited for them on the other side of the fence, and how easy it was to drive and walk through a fence that was built at the cost of $1 billion shekel, $1 billion, and was supposed to be impenetratable, and then was breached so easily because no fence is solid absent firepower to prevent breaches. And finally, policy. I think something here is even deeper. I mean, we have to recall that for about 14 years now, the Israeli security establishment was under instructions from Prime Minister Netanyahu in all 14 years minus one, to pursue a strategy that was standing on two legs. One leg was strengthening Hamas, and the other one was weakening the Palestinian Authority. Now, we have all discussed it at length at IPF and elsewhere. Strengthening Hamas so that we have an address with which we can do business. A little bit of release, easing of the closure in return for tranquility. Well, in those 14 years, we had 19 rounds of skirmishes with Hamas, and the failure of this policy was evident until it escalated to the moment when it really crushed 3 days ago, and weakening the PA, lest it emerges as a viable partner for negotiations, something this prime minister was determined to avoid. And a few words on what's coming. I'm not sure it's just because of public pressure. I think it is also strategic calculation of the effect on all evil wishers of Israel in the region, from Iran westward, that Israel has to change the equation in Gaza for a very long time to come. So what's happening now from the air is very powerful and far less restricted to consider the humanitarian cost, and that's a serious escalation. But no more human shield protecting Hamas facilities, Hamas gatherings, Hamas operational centers, or weapon depots. The fact that Hamas has chosen, obviously deliberately, to establish itself in the midst of civilian population can no longer serve as a deterrent. And I think Neri hinted at it, that the ground operation is coming. We have an unprecedented 300,000 men mobilization. Units report of 150, 200% attendance as compared to the number summoned. So the army will take another day or two or whatever it takes to prepare, to train, to finalize plans, but we're going to see a major operation. So I will just end with the hope that when planning such a massive operation, the accent is on an exit strategy.
Thank you, Neri, Shira, and Nimrod. Michael, I want to bring you in. We have already, I think, 40 questions from the audience, which we won't be able to get to them all. But Michael, I wonder if you could just assess for us thus far the international reaction, the US reaction, and what are the prospects of this? We've had a number of questions about the risk of a wider regional war. And I wonder if you could touch on that as well. And ultimately, what does this forced posture by the US ultimately signal? And at what point does that become an equation in all of this as well?
Thanks, David. First, I've of course been in touch with Shira, Neri, and Nimrod since Saturday, but it's good to see everybody's faces, which I had not had the opportunity to do yet. So I think the U.S. response is what people who have been paying attention would have expected. There's all sorts of completely over the top and discredited chatter about this administration being anti-Israel and somehow facilitating or enabling this attack, which is largely, if not entirely, nonsense. What we've actually seen is the Biden administration sending a carrier strike group to the Eastern Mediterranean, which is first and foremost aimed at deterring Iran, Hezbollah, or other Iranian proxies from opening up another front in this war. Whether it will be successful or not remains to be seen, but it's an enormous statement from the United States that if another front is opened, the U.S. is there and ready to be involved. There have also been guarantees of munitions for Israel, whatever they need in terms of Iron Dome interceptors and other weapons. So the U.S. is doing what I think we expect the U.S. to do, which is really give Israel all the backing it needs, and particularly at a time when there's this outside perception that Israel is in chaos. And I think that it's safe to say, especially since all of us on this webinar have been talking about this for months. Safe to say that part of the reason this happened was because of this perception of Israel and chaos. It's good to see the United States stepping up and doing what it can to try and bat down this notion that Israel is easily overrun, or that Israel stands alone. In terms of what it means for a wider regional war, American efforts right now and Israeli efforts are, as I said, aimed at deterring the Iranians from opening up another front. There's been some noise on the northern border, as Neri highlighted. It has not yet translated into anything full scale. I think most people expected that Hezbollah was going to have to do something, if just to sort of check a box and weigh in, and hopefully that's all this will be, and it won't lead to something bigger. But if it does lead to something bigger, then I don't know that anybody can rule out the possibility of direct Israeli military action on Iran as well. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about Iranian involvement in planning. There have been I saw the IDF spokesman issued an official denial of sorts, where he said that Israel did not have that same information, or had not confirmed that report. Of course, everyone understands that there is an Iranian role in generally arming and supporting and training Hamas, and to an even greater extent Hezbollah. But I think that in many ways, Hezbollah not opening up another front with Israel is Iran's attempt at deterring Israel from striking at Iran. Once Hezbollah opens up that front, then I'm not sure that there's a reason for Israel to limit itself from striking Iran directly. So we'll see what transpires. Hopefully, what transpires will be largely quiet.
Neri, we have a ton of questions that have come in about the fate of the hostages. Has there been any talk about what Israel's strategy, if any, would be at this stage regarding their fate?
Not publicly. Much of the rhetoric, if not almost all of the rhetoric, coming from senior Israeli officials from the top on down, talks more about going in and dismantling Hamas capabilities, essentially wiping out Hamas and the other groups as actual fighting forces, and less public remarks about how they're going to resolve the fact that over 100 at least Israelis are being held in captivity. It's a really difficult question, especially as we've been discussing the likelihood of an actual and deep ground operation by the IDF into Gaza is now on the table in a real way. What I expect may happen, I don't know if this is an issue for the coming days or the coming weeks, is that at a certain point, a deal will be struck between the two sides, an interim hostage exchange where the women and children and the elderly, and there are a lot of them, being held by Hamas, are released, and female Palestinian prisoners and maybe Palestinian prisoners that are minors will also be released. And maybe in that way you start, I guess, resolving that situation. It won't resolve it completely, but that's my expectation. But again, that all depends on the dynamics on the ground, right? If Israel continues to escalate, and Hamas continues to fire, and then you have maybe Hezbollah joining in, I don't know what the prospect of an actual hostage exchange deal will be. And I'll just add as well, over the past hour or 2 hours, the spokesman of the Hamas military wing issued a statement saying that if Israel continued striking civilian homes in the Gaza Strip, that they would begin executing Israeli civilians that they held and filming it and broadcasting it. So I don't know what that would do for the public psyche in Israel right now, which is still reeling and very much traumatized. To say nothing of the international reaction to executing, say, an elderly woman on live television.
Astonishing. Shira, can you say a word about the psyche of the Israeli society at the moment? I think this comes also, of course, in the aftermath of the deepest divisions political and societal divisions that Israel has faced in its history. I think that we have seen remarkable solidarity emerging, but I wonder if you could speak to how Israeli public, Israeli people have responded in the hours since this attack.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners have relatives and people they know in Israel, so they probably hear this. I don't think anyone is spared. I don't live in a Gaza border community. My kids are too young to serve in the IDF, and yet I already know of 3 soldiers, sons of my friends and former colleagues that have died. My son goes to a school right here, but there's a boarding school. Kids from his school in middle school have been abducted. They're in Gaza now. Of course, injuries, people in the south that we keep looking for, guests from the north that are fleeing here. It affects everyone, and you need to understand that even in our sort of ultra liberal circles, right, that keep thinking about, we don't want to have, of course, collective punishment of Hamas, and see, you hear people that saying that this is a Hiroshima and Nagasaki moment for Israel. Yeah, maybe we should conduct a war crime to end all violence for the future. Not that this is my position, but I think this is the psychic. I think that when Israelis here see protests, pro-Palestinian protests in London and in San Francisco and even in New York, and they see a letter at Harvard and even if those are marginal groups, people are just saying, forget, this, I'm talking about people, not sort of the popular opinion, but even the sort of like those that have Palestinian friends and Arab friends who say, wait, but what if ISIS, and this is ISIS level actions, right? We're talking about slaughter, we're talking about children, kidnapping, dementive elderly people, kidnapping, rape, in the hundreds and in the thousands of casualties, and also in the hundreds abducted. What if ISIS would occupy your towns and cities for 36 hours, for 48 hours? How would you be? So I think this sort of creates there's a real urge in Israel to tell the story and share the snuff, and for the people to understand that this is not your ordinary freedom fighters, right? And that nothing, and we're IPF here, right? We're an organization founded to end the occupation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a two-state solution. Nothing can justify this. So this is the psychic, but how this is a continuously evolving, obviously, and I think with ground operation, we're likely to see more and more casualties, right? Also on the Israeli side, the leverage, the credit that Israel now has from the U.S. and Europe and others could look differently in a few days, when the number of casualties in Gaza start climbing, and with Israel disconnecting supplies to Gaza. And this is going to affect people here also.
Sorry, I was on mute. Nimrod, why don't we have a national unity government already? Should we expect one to be formed? But what is your take on the next political steps as Israel begins to execute what we all widely believe to be its largest operation yet in Gaza? Can it do so amidst with the current structure of this coalition? When can we expect, if at all, a unity to emerge?
I think that the play with national unity, which is essential, emergency cabinet, is a microcosmos of something that Shira has touched upon, and that is the collapse. One of the initial reactions, and it's still happening, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, if at all, is the total collapse of public confidence in leadership. This time it's both in, do you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, because you all froze. Sorry about that.
we're
This time it's not just the political leadership, but there is also lack of a collapse of confidence in the top echelons of the security establishment, the media reporting and broadcasting, individuals in their safety rooms in the south for 10 hours with tiny little children, as long as they still have batteries in their phones, calling in to radio stations, to friends, to anybody they could, and they don't understand why after 10 hours, the IDF is not there. Nobody is showing up. That left a mark, and that's not going to go away. So the combination of how does the political leadership allow us to get to this point, and how come the military leadership allow this to transpire the way it did, will reverberate for a while, and will have political consequences. And the fact that the prime minister now is playing with the idea of a national unity cabinet, and as Neri says, he's going on the air soon, so he might come up with a positive answer, but this was offered to him better than 24 hours ago in an emergency situation. And Benny Gantz just made absolutely no preconditions. Lapid asked that this unity cabinet will not include two of its current members and maybe more, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and for very good reason. Gantz even didn't ask for that. Gantz just said, let's have a what we call here a kitchen cabinet, which is before every cabinet meeting, a smaller group that does not include the lunatics, discusses the security situation, makes a decision, and then it's up to the prime minister to sell it to the cabinet members when the broader cabinet convenes. Such an offer he should have accepted in 5 minutes and should have been forward in 5 hours. It reminds me, again, I'm old enough to remember the lessons of 73, and I'm also old enough to remember the sins of 73. And it reminds me of when Golda Meir was approached. Everybody loves Golda now because of the movie, but some of us hold her responsible for what happened. And when she was offered the idea of a national unity cabinet, she said, "We don't need partners for the victory." And I'm afraid that the prime minister's calculus at the moment is, at the end, I will remain responsible for the failure, and these guys came for salvation. So he's making this personal, selfish consideration about the national interest. I don't think that he will be able to resist for long.
Thank you. There are so many questions, so I'm doing an effort at combining a number of the questions that have come in. But Michael, I want you to address some of the speculation analysis over the last 48 hours that much of this may have been motivated by the push towards Israel-Saudi normalization. How do you assess that? How do you assess the future of that? I know it's incredibly early to tell, but I wonder if you can comment on that.
In the short term, I think it's a curious claim to be making. There are people suggesting that because Israel and Saudi Arabia seems to be moving closer together in the last few weeks or months, that somehow a decision was made to launch this, when in reality an operation like this was almost certainly in the planning stages for months and months, well before most people, not us, but well before most people were talking about Israel-Saudi normalization. But in the larger scheme of things, obviously the Iranians, and by extension Hamas and other groups, do not want to see Saudi Arabia or anyone else normalize relations with Israel. This is a pretty terrible but convenient way to throw a wrench into those calculations. And while I certainly stand by what I and what Shira have said and written about Saudi normalization being a matter of when, not if. Hard to see that now happening in the next 6 to 12 months, which in some ways is what things were moving toward. So I think this will certainly put a damper on it. The statement that the Saudis issued in the aftermath of this was, to my mind, extremely disappointing. If nothing else, I think that's a sign of how difficult it's going to be for the Saudis to keep on moving forward with this, with what we all expect to be coming, which is an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza, which is going to result in many, many Palestinian casualties.
So I'm going to come back to you, Neri, because we have a lot of questions that touch on two different issues. One is the prospect of a preemptive strike by Israel against Hezbollah in order to strike first, essentially, amidst all of this, and another set of questions that are simply about what is the strategic objectives of the IDF heading into this Gaza operation, which is a question I'm happy for everyone to take, but it's but I'll direct it first to you, Neri, which is, we haven't yet spoken about the state of the PA and how it emerges from this round, but I believe yesterday the IDF spokesperson said that the two primary objectives of the IDF were to eliminate Hamas's ability to strike Israel and eliminate its ability to govern, which raises a lot of questions about what comes after. So Neri, what do you see as the potential strategic objectives on the as we enter into this, what is very likely a ground invasion war?
Yeah, I mean, both questions are well taken. I don't know if I have an answer to either one of them. Starting with the northern front, look, we can't rule out a preemptive Israeli move to preempt what Hezbollah may be planning, in and of itself, right? Although it would be a huge gamble just because of the state of both the society and the army right now. That may change in the coming days. But the IDF, until earlier today, was still trying to get a grip on a few communities in southern Israel. It can't be ruled out, but I think on the whole, Israeli officials and strategists are hoping that Hezbollah is deterred enough to stay out of this round, regardless of what happens in Gaza, and that remains to be seen and to be tested. In terms of the Israeli objective vis-a-vis Gaza, look, to allude to what was discussed earlier, what we saw on Saturday was the complete collapse of many things, faith in the Israeli authorities, faith in the power of the vaunted Israeli military, and so on and so forth. But it was definitely a collapse of what had been a longstanding Israeli strategy vis-a-vis a Hamas-ruled Gaza since the Hamas takeover, but really since the 2014 war. After the 2014 war, that's when we saw this strategic shift by Israel, where you saw things like cash moving in with Israeli approval to Hamas to fund whatever they wanted. And to, with each successive round, especially after 2021, you saw more and more restrictions being lifted up to now, including almost 20,000 workers that had been allowed to move from Gaza into Israel for the first time since the Hamas takeover. All of that strategy, easing the restrictions on Gaza, easing the blockade in return for Hamas essentially and theoretically ensuring quiet, that blew up completely in the worst way possible on Saturday. So there's no going back to that strategy. Again, like I said, both publicly in terms of the mood, politically in terms of what's possible for any politician here right now, and also strategically. And many of us, especially over the past year or so, have been at least questioning, both publicly on the podcast and in other places, as well as directly to IDF officials that I was speaking to. It's like, do you actually believe that you're deterring Hamas? Do you actually believe your strategy is working? And the answers we got all the time was, yes, it's working. There might be Islamic Jihad escalations here and there, but it's better than the alternative. And also, what's the alternative? We don't want to go in and reoccupy Gaza. All of that has gone out the window. And now, for the first time since really the Hamas takeover in 2007, the possibility of Israel going in and at the very least trying to quote unquote clean out Gaza from the militant groups and also potentially reoccupying the Strip, all of that is on the table. All of that is on the table in a real way for the first time ever. And again, it would require certain intestinal fortitude by this prime minister and also whatever cabinet is making this decision to actually give this a green light, both because of the high cost of going into Gaza on the ground anyway, and also all the Israeli hostages being held. I don't know if you can just turn your back on all those hostages as you go in and try to move in massive numbers of IDF divisions into Gaza. So it's not an easy decision at all, but I think what's certain is that this won't be, again, to emphasize the point, this won't be like previous rounds with Hamas in Gaza. There's no going back, whether this takes a week, a month, 2 months, like we saw in 2014. There's not going to be an Egyptian or a UN or Qatari mediator flying in, and then we're going to hear about a ceasefire being brokered on Al Jazeera, like in every single previous round. That I don't think is tenable this time.
Yeah, David, if I can just add to what Neri said, I think Neri is obviously right on everything, but I think it's easier said than done, right? To go in, to topple Hamas, to eliminate Hamas's military infrastructure. You also need to eliminate the political infrastructure. There's Hamas leadership in not only Lebanon, Turkey, Qatar, where, by the way, Michael Ismail Haniyeh said publicly that, derailing the normalization with Saudi was one of their objectives. Of course, it was very convenient to say now, but we saw in the last few months that it itches for them. So, and then I think it addresses also some of the questions on the podcast. It's like, what comes next? Because the Palestinian Authority, and say a few words about the Palestinian Authority in a moment, but it is not an effectively governing body at the moment at the West Bank. The thought that it will ride Israeli tanks to control the Gaza Strip, so much has to happen there. Operationally, also clear the militant groups, obviously, but also the political structure that will start a new diplomatic process that I just don't see anyone thinking about at the moment, let alone this government, right? So who would come there? Do you think Israel has the appetite of reoccupying and supplying the basic needs of 2.2 million Palestinians? It's something that's easier said than done, and how do you really bring the PA at the current state of the PA? It's something that we can just say, but we can't implement it at the moment. A lot of things and many years have to pass by. This could be an opportunity. I'm not saying it can, but you would need to leverage and use this war. It's not an operation, this war, to achieve something big on the diplomatic level. And I just don't see this happening. I will just say in terms of the PA now, because, speaking with some friends in Ramallah and speaking around the PA circles, I mean, they're in a predicament. They are scared. They fear for a security blow up in the West Bank as well, right? They're scared that we know that Hamas has been trying to light up the West Bank on fire for a long time. They're scared of Hamas and other groups. They're scared of the publics that would rally in masses, especially as the pictures from Gaza become worse. And they're extremely terrified of settler violence. Security coordination continues. Despite, I think, nudging by different leaders, Abu Mazen and his group are not condemning yet. I know there are some Palestinian civil society groups that are scared, would like to condemn, but they're scared of what, how this, I think it's advisable for them and also to Abu Mazen to condemn this, not only because this is the right thing, and he has shown historically that he is able to stand and say, I'm not for violence. And if there's ever a time to do this, this would be the time to do it. That this is not a fighting occupation, this is not our way. But also there are threats by Germany and other European capitals to cut funding to the Palestinians. They're on a lifeline anyway. People are saying, oh, what will happen if Gaza doesn't have water? Gaza doesn't have water anyway. Gaza had 8 hours of electricity, so they have 3. I mean, it's terrible, don't get me wrong, but we're moving from a humanitarian disaster to a catastrophe. This is a situation, and I think this is literally playing with fire, but there is a very precarious situation also in the West Bank.
Nimrod, you want to add?
Yeah. From at the outset, I suggested that I hope that when they're planning the ground operation into Gaza, the accent will be on the exit strategy. And I must confess that of all the three formulas that are being considered, all the way from the most extreme that nobody has an appetite for, and that is conquering the entire Gaza Strip and doing a house-to-house cleanup of weapons and militants and infrastructure and so on. Nobody has an appetite for that. The lesser one is follow up on this massive air operation by a serious effort, but limited one in terms of time and scope, territorial scope and otherwise, of inflicting serious punishment on Hamas leadership and leadership infrastructure, communication, tunnels, and so on. And the least ambitious is the one for a very short incursion. The common denominator for all three is the experience of the US in Afghanistan, 20 years, the experience of Israel in Lebanon, 18 years. Nobody anticipated that when Menachem Begin announced that we are entering Lebanon up to 40 kilometers in 48 hours. We ended up being there 18 years. I don't see a good exit strategy that leaves Gaza ungovernable without any central authority, with warlords, armed warlords and gangs, unruly by anybody. And I'm just afraid that we're going to be sucked in to a lot more than we have in mind. So I just hope that the preparatory phase is going to be very, very thorough. I just want to say another word on good news.
Please.
We are all hard pressed to find good news, and I'm afraid that even the good news is going to sneak away from us very rapidly. The good news thus far is that there was hardly a uprising on the West Bank, and none among Israeli Arabs. Unlike we all recall the previous occasion when all five fronts were ignited. But I wonder if indeed we go for a comprehensive, massive operation in Gaza, whether that sort of good news is sustainable.
Yeah, Michael, you want to add anything?
I think that it really, to build on Nimrod's point about hoping that people are thinking about the end game and what happens after. The West Bank and Gaza are very different, and it's for many reasons. But one of them is that there is a real difference, despite all the problems that we talk about with the Palestinian Authority, between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And I think that there are a lot of things that have to happen next. Israel dealing with Hamas militarily is one and is going to be the first, as it should be. But there also, I think, needs to be an Israeli shift in course and a Palestinian shift in course. Because if going forward, Israel is going to drop this strategy that has clearly been a failure of keeping Hamas in power in Gaza in a relatively weakened state, and also doing what it can to weaken the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is the body that is going to lead toward negotiations and talk of two states, whereas with Hamas, you never have to address that issue. If we can assume that insane strategy that's really been dominant for almost 15 years now is finally dead and gone, then it's not just about the shift in how you treat Hamas. It also has to be a shift in how you treat the PA. And all of us here, all five of us, have talked for years about ways in which the PA can be brought back to Gaza, and doing it on the literal backs of Israeli tanks is probably not a viable option if you want the PA to actually be there. But this is the opportunity to, when this is done, get the PA into Gaza and accept the fact that the PA is far from perfect, has all sorts of problems, but it's better than what you have now in Gaza. And I think that sitting here today, almost anybody would love to see what you have in the West Bank now in Gaza, with all of the problems that brings with it. And so if that isn't at the top of Israeli decision makers' minds right now, and thinking about how to get to that situation, because it is certainly a better one than the one that exists now, then Israeli leaders will be falling down on the job.
I want to thank all of you for taking time to share your thoughts in this very evolving situation, and we certainly hope that this situation does, not open up, even as I see reports of further clashes in the north. We will certainly continue to follow developments closely. And I want to say to everybody on this call that Israel Policy Forum is committed to doing all we can to be supportive, to be a supportive resource for you and your communities in the days and weeks to come. Please feel free to reach out directly to us. And I also want to say to everyone on the call to please take a moment to check in on your family and your friends in Israel, and to be with community and to take care of yourselves. At these very difficult times, it's incredibly important that we find those opportunities to be in community. And I certainly hope and pray that everyone's loved ones that are joining us today are, of course, safe. We will continue to provide updates, analysis, commentary, and resources on this unfolding situation. And we welcome your reaching out to us for any needs that you or your community may have. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Neri, Shira, Nimrod, and Michael, for your insights and for all you do every day. And look forward to connecting with you all soon.